There is a map I keep coming back to. It is a standard global shipping lane map, the kind you can find on any maritime analytics platform. Blue lines trace the routes that carry nearly 90% of the world's traded goods across the oceans. These lines cluster in predictable places: the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Strait of Hormuz. These are the pinch points of global trade, the places where a single decision, a single blockade, a single natural disaster can choke the flow of goods between continents. I have spent a long time studying that map, and about a year ago, I noticed something that I genuinely could not explain at first. On the western coast of South America, in a small coastal town in Peru, about 80 kilometers north of Lima, there was a new dot. A port that had not been on older versions of this map. A port that, when I drew a straight line eastward across the Atlantic, pointed directly at the coast of West Africa and the ports of China's Belt and Road network. And when I drew a straight line westward across the Pacific, that line bypassed completely, cleanly, without touching a single US-aligned choke point, and arrived directly at Shanghai. I sat with that for a while, and then I started asking a question that I could not find a good answer to anywhere in the mainstream conversation. Why has Washington been so quiet about this? That silence, that specific, deliberate, institutional silence, is the reason I am making this video today. Because what has been quietly built on the coast of Peru is not just a port. It is a statement about who controls the Pacific, and by extension, who controls the future of global trade. The port is called Chancay, and I believe it is one of the most consequential infrastructure projects built anywhere on Earth in the last decade. Let me set the scene, because the location of this port matters enormously to understanding what it represents. Chancay is a small Peruvian coastal town. Before 2019, if you had searched for it online, you would have found articles about a local fishing industry, some archaeological sites from pre-Inca civilization, and not much else. It was a quiet place, the kind of place that global logistics planners would have looked at on a map and passed over. And that is exactly why COSCO Shipping chose it. COSCO, the China Ocean Shipping Company, is the world's third largest shipping conglomerate and a state-owned enterprise of the People's Republic of China. In 2019, COSCO acquired a 60% stake in the Chancay Port Development Project from Vulcan Compañía Minera, a major Peruvian mining corporation that had originally planned to use the site for a private mineral export facility. The deal was relatively quiet. It did not make front-page news outside of specialized maritime trade publications, but the plans that followed it were anything but quiet. A deepwater port capable of handling the largest container vessels in the world, the so-called megaships that most South American ports simply cannot accommodate because they lack the depth. A port with a projected annual throughput capacity across all planned phases of more than 1 million containers per year. An automated terminal with the kind of robotic crane and logistics systems that China had already perfected at its own domestic ports in Tianjin and Qingdao. And critically, a port with direct road and eventually rail connections into the interior of South America, toward the resource-rich regions of Peru, Brazil, and Bolivia. I want you to hold that last point because we will come back to it. The port was never just about shipping things in and out of Peru. The geography of where it sits, and what lies behind it, is the entire point of its existence. When I first looked at the construction timeline, I had to double-check the dates. Because what was accomplished here, in sheer speed and engineering complexity, usually takes a decade and a half. COSCO and its construction partners, primarily China Communications Construction Company, one of the world's largest infrastructure builders, broke ground formally in 2021. Phase 1 was completed and formally inaugurated in November 2024. That is approximately 3 years from groundbreaking to first commercial ship. For context, the Port of Hamburg's most recent expansion took 11 years. The Fehmarn Belt Tunnel in Europe has been in planning and construction for over 15 years. Port expansions in the United States routinely take a decade from initial environmental review to operational status, assuming the project survives legal challenges. Chankay Phase 1 went from concept to fully operational in roughly 3 years. The initial phase includes 4 deepwater berths capable of handling vessels with a draft of up to 17 meters, deep enough to accommodate the largest container ships currently in service anywhere in the world, vessels carrying 24,000 standard containers per trip. It includes an automated container yard covering approximately 230 hectares. It has integrated rail sidings connecting to Peru's national freight network. And it has a breakwater structure, an artificial barrier built to protect ships from Pacific swells. That is itself one of the largest marine engineering structures ever built in South America. The entire Phase 1 investment is estimated at around $3.5 billion US. When Phase 2 is completed, already underway, the total investment will approach $5 billion, with some analyses of the full logistics ecosystem projecting a combined economic footprint of closer to $50 billion when you factor in roads, warehousing zones, industrial parks, and export corridor projects developed in coordination with the port. I want to be honest about that 50 billion figure. The core port infrastructure itself is a multi-billion-dollar project. The broader ecosystem figure is a projection based on connected development. The distinction matters, and I want you to trust I am not rounding up to make the story bigger. The story is already big enough. Let me tell you about the moment this story clicked into place. I was using a maritime route optimization tool, the kind shipping companies use to calculate the fastest path between 2 ports. I entered 2 locations, Shanghai, China, and a hypothetical origin on the western coast of South America. Before Chankay was operational, the primary route for cargo moving from the Pacific coast of South America to China went one of 2 ways. Either north, through the Panama Canal, across the Caribbean, and then across the Pacific on a long westward arc, adding significant distance and canal fees. Or south, around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America, an extremely difficult passage that most modern megaships avoid because of the violent seas and navigational complexity. Neither route was efficient, neither was cheap, and both had a problem shipping analysts called chokepoint vulnerability. They pass through or near geographic or political bottlenecks that third-party actors could influence or disrupt. The Panama Canal is controlled under a treaty framework that gives the United States significant influence over access and operations. The U.S. military maintains a strong presence throughout the Caribbean approaches. Cape Horn routes ships through waters where U.S. naval assets operate with near total dominance. Now look at what Chankay changes. A ship departing Chankay's deepwater berth and heading west across the Pacific takes a direct Great Circle route, the shortest possible path on the globe, and arrives at Shanghai without passing through the Panama Canal, without passing through the Strait of Malacca, without transiting any water where a U.S. naval or political presence could influence access. The transit time from Chankay to Shanghai on this direct route is approximately 23 days. The previous routing via Panama and across the Pacific took 35 days or more. That is a 12-day reduction. In shipping, 12 days is not a minor improvement. 12 days, multiplied across hundreds of voyages per year across millions of containers, represents billions of dollars in saved fuel, labor, and capital costs. And here's where the silence from Washington starts to make sense, in a troubling way. Because that direct route does not just save China time and money. It removes China's dependence on a corridor the United States has historically been able to monitor, influence, and, in a scenario of genuine conflict, potentially interrupt. The route from Chankay to Shanghai gives China a trans-Pacific supply chain corridor that is, for practical purposes, outside the traditional sphere of U.S. strategic maritime influence. That is not something the United States government wants to advertise publicly, because publicly acknowledging it would require explaining what the response is. And as of recording this, I have not been able to find a clear publicly stated US government response to what Shanghai represents strategically. I told you earlier to hold a thought about what lies behind Shanghai. Now let me unpack that. Peru is one of the world's most resource-rich countries. It is the world's second largest producer of copper. It is a top 5 global producer of gold, zinc, silver, lead, and tin. It contains significant lithium deposits in its southern highlands. And crucially, Bolivia, which shares a deep economic relationship with Peru and has historically relied on Peruvian Pacific Coast access for its exports, holds the world's largest known lithium reserves. China's industrial economy runs on these materials. Copper for electrical infrastructure and electric vehicle motors, lithium for batteries, rare earth minerals for semiconductors and defense systems. China has been strategically acquiring access to these resources across South America for over 2 decades through Belt and Road investments, mining concessions, and bilateral trade deals. But access to raw materials is only half the equation. The other half is getting those materials out efficiently. Previous South American port infrastructure had always been a limiting factor. The ports on the Pacific coast, Callao in Peru, Valparaiso in Chile, Guayaquil in Ecuador, were simply not designed to handle the volumes or vessel sizes China's industrial appetite demands. Shanghai changes this equation fundamentally. With a port that can handle the world's largest vessels at high volume, China can now move South American copper, lithium, iron ore, and agricultural commodities, soybeans, corn, fish meal, at a scale and speed previously impossible. The World Bank's trade analysts flagged this in a 2024 report, noting that Shanghai represents a structural shift in trans-Pacific commodity flows, with potential to redirect a significant share of South American raw material exports away from routes that transit through U.S. influence corridors. There is also a secondary economic story, and I think it does not get enough attention. The port is not just an export facility. It is designed as an import gateway. Chinese manufactured goods, electronics, machinery, electric vehicles, construction equipment can now reach Peru, and by extension the broader Andean region, faster and more cheaply than before. This has direct competitive implications for American manufacturers who have historically dominated parts of the South American import markets. I looked at trade data for Chinese manufactured exports to Peru since the port agreement was signed. Between 2019 and 2024, Chinese imports as a share of Peru's total goods imports grew by a statistically significant margin, even before Phase 1 was operational. The port's existence, just the certainty it was coming, was already reshaping trade relationships. Here is something I want to be very deliberate about, because it is easy to overstate and just as easy to miss entirely. Shanghai is not a military facility. I want to say that clearly. There is no verified evidence it is designed to host Chinese naval vessels. And the Peruvian government has been explicit that the port is a commercial infrastructure project. Peru is not a Chinese military ally. It maintains its own foreign policy, and its relationship with the United States, while complicated, includes significant security and economic ties. But here is where the distinction between military and strategic starts to blur in ways that matter. The concept of dual-use infrastructure is one of the most important ideas in modern geopolitical analysis. Port infrastructure, deep water berths, fuel storage, logistics networks, communication systems, is inherently dual-use. A berth deep enough for a 30-meter commercial ship is also deep enough for a naval vessel. A logistics network designed to move millions of containers of copper and soybeans is, with modifications, capable of supporting military supply chains. The United States understands this better than anyone. The entire history of American overseas base construction in the 20th century began with port and logistics infrastructure. The U.S. naval station at Guantanamo Bay started as a coaling station for commercial shipping. The strategic value of U.S. facilities in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines is inseparable from the port infrastructure those locations include. I'm not saying Shanghai is a Chinese military base in disguise. The evidence does not support that claim, and I refuse to make it. What I am saying is that the United States has historically been acutely sensitive to the development of deep water port capacity anywhere in the Western Hemisphere by a non-allied power. And the fact that Chankey has not generated the kind of public strategic response that earlier Chinese infrastructure investments triggered is genuinely worth examining. There is one historical data point I keep returning to. When Chinese telecommunications company Huawei began supplying equipment to Panama in 2017, the response from the US State Department was swift and loud. Congressional hearings, public warnings, intense diplomatic pressure on Panama. The argument was that Huawei's proximity to the Panama Canal, a critical US strategic interest, created an unacceptable intelligence and security risk. The Panama Canal handles roughly 3% of global shipping by volume. The strategic conversation Chankey is already beginning to reshape involves a considerably larger slice of trans-Pacific commodity flows. The contrast in public response is striking. The most charitable explanation is that Washington is responding privately, diplomatically, in ways not yet surfaced in public reporting. The less charitable explanation is that the strategic shift represented by Chankey happened faster than anyone anticipated, and the public response is still catching up. I want to spend a moment on what is currently under construction, because Phase 2 is in some ways more significant than what has already been built. The expansion plans COSCO and the Peruvian Port Authority have approved will add an additional 6 berths to the existing 4, bringing total capacity to 10 deepwater berths capable of simultaneous megaship operations. This would make Chankey the largest container port on the Pacific coast of the Americas, surpassing the Port of Los Angeles, currently the busiest port on the US West Coast. Let me repeat that. A port that did not exist in its current form 5 years ago is, upon completion of its second phase, projected to have greater berthing capacity than the Port of Los Angeles. But the physical port is only the most visible part. Alongside the Phase 2 berths, the project includes development of a dedicated industrial free trade zone adjacent to the port, a logistics and manufacturing park covering several thousand hectares that is explicitly designed to attract Chinese manufacturing operations seeking a location outside of China that can serve the South American market while benefiting from Peruvian trade agreements with the United States and the European Union. This free trade zone dimension is something I find particularly significant, and it is almost entirely absent from English language media coverage. If you cannot find analysis of the Chankey free trade zone in your usual news sources, I encourage you to go looking, because it is in that detail that the long-term economic architecture becomes clear. A Chinese manufacturer operating inside the Chankey free trade zone under Peruvian incorporation, with Peruvian trade treaty access, can export goods to the United States under trade terms that do not apply to goods exported directly from China. This is not an accident of geography. It is a deliberate design feature of how Chinese global economic strategy has evolved in response to US tariffs and trade restrictions. The port in this reading is not just a shipping facility. It is a platform for Chinese economic activity to access global markets through a new structural pathway. One that is legal, commercially transparent, and strategically elegant. I want to address something that deserves more attention in Western coverage of Chinese infrastructure investments in the developing world. The framing of China building ports in South America, or Africa, or Southeast Asia, often defaults quickly into a geopolitical competition narrative, treating the host country as a passive backdrop. As if Peru is simply terrain on which China and the United States are playing out a strategic chess match with no agency of its own. That framing is incomplete, and it does a disservice to understanding what is actually happening. Peru is a country of 33 million people with a complex democratic history, a diverse and resource-rich economy, and a sophisticated political class that has been navigating competing interests of major powers for generations. The government of Peru did not sleepwalk into the Chankey deal and negotiated a framework that, in its public terms, includes significant employment commitments, technology transfer provisions, Peruvian equity stakes through the Vulcan Partnership, and infrastructure development obligations extending well beyond the port itself. Peruvian economists who have publicly analyzed the deal, including researchers at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, one of the country's most respected research institutions, have raised legitimate questions about the long-term terms of the concession, pricing mechanisms for port services, and the degree to which economic benefits genuinely flow to Peruvian workers versus Chinese-owned entities. These are valid questions. They are the same questions informed Peruvians are asking and debating in their own democratic context. My point is not that Chancay is unambiguously good for Peru. My point is that Peru is an active participant in this story, with real interest and real agency. And the analysis is impoverished when that dimension is skipped in favor of pure US-China framing. What I can say with confidence, for Peru's export economy, the operational efficiency gains from a deep-water port capable of handling megaships represent a genuine and substantial improvement over what existed before. Peruvian copper miners, fish meal producers, and agricultural exporters are, by the testimony of several industry associations, already seeing reduced logistics costs and faster transit times to Asian markets. That economic reality exists independently of the geopolitical conversation. I started this video with a map. I want to end with one as well, though this time I want you to imagine it. Picture the Pacific Ocean. It is the largest body of water on Earth. It covers more area than all the world's land masses combined. For the better part of the last century, it has been, in strategic terms, an American lake. U.S. naval presence, U.S. alliance networks, U.S.-aligned choke points at its eastern and western approaches have meant that the movement of goods and energy across the Pacific happened in a context shaped by American power. Now, draw a straight line from a small town on the Peruvian coast, westward across that ocean to Shanghai. That line does not cross the Panama Canal. It does not approach the Hawaiian Islands, where U.S. Pacific Command is headquartered. It does not transit any strait where a U.S. ally or U.S. asset sits in a position of influence. It is a clean line, a direct line, and increasingly, it is a heavily trafficked line. China has not announced it is challenging U.S. Pacific dominance. There has been no declaration, no military confrontation, no dramatic moment that would make a clear before and after narrative easy to construct. What has happened instead is quieter and, in some ways, more consequential. A port was built, ships began moving through it, trade flows began to shift, and the geographic architecture of Pacific commerce began, slowly and irreversibly, to change. That is how power transitions often actually happen. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in infrastructure. Not in declarations, but in shipping lanes. Not in the news cycle, but in the slow accumulation of logistical facts that eventually add up to a new reality. Chancay is one of those facts. And it deserves far more attention than it has received. If this story made you think differently about how global power actually operates, not in press releases and summits, but in ports and shipping lanes and resource corridors, then we have accomplished something worthwhile together today. These are the developments that shape the world your children will inherit, and understanding them is the first step toward thinking clearly about what they mean. I will keep watching this story as Phase 2 develops, as trade data accumulates, and as the political response, or continued silence, from Washington evolves. There is much more to say, and I intend to say it. Thank you for watching.